Executive Director for the Freedom Center. We are the Center for Independent Living that serves Frederick and Carroll counties. I want to welcome everybody today. I'm going to do a couple of announcements, let people know things, and then I'll turn it over, so I'll be relatively quick. Independence Amplified Maryland I Am is a weekly live stream broadcast brought to you by the Centers for Independent Living in Maryland, where we try to bring together people and information relevant to persons with disabilities living here in Maryland, sometimes relevant to persons anywhere, not just in Maryland. And it's also a time to ask questions, to gather information, to do some networking. We usually do that time at the end. The host will mute everyone, or should be muting everyone initially. That cuts down on sort of the background noise and the interference. When we get to, if you have questions that you can think of, please put them in the chat box. If you can access the chat box, you can raise your hand to ask a question. Someone is monitoring the chat box and the other features on Zoom, and we do our best to get to your questions. We try to leave time for that throughout the broadcast. Let me think what else I want to say. So today, we have a very special sort of ADA celebration. Remember the signing of the ADA 30 years ago yesterday. So this is perfect timing for that. Today we have three giants in the Maryland disability movement here to talk about the ADA, what it means to them, what they've seen over the years, maybe where we're going. Actually, I just put that out there. I have no idea what they're really going to talk about. But we have today Kathy Raggio, former Secretary of the Department of Disabilities, Marion Vessels, longtime leader of the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, Marcia Maz, the Director of Accessibility Codes and Standards for United Spinal Accessibility Program. They are going to be talking with one of our other SIL directors, Katie Collins-Erkey, who will be hosting and facilitating that discussion.
And this program is being broadcast, will be broadcast and stored on YouTube.
Right. All of the IAM programs are recorded and they are rebroadcast on the YouTube page, Image Center's YouTube page. It usually can take up to a week to get that rebroadcast on there. You are welcome to visit their YouTube page and look at some of the earlier broadcasts. Also, I want to remind people, if this is valuable to you and this is good information and you want to help us keep it going, this does at times cost money. And so when you go to register on the form, there is the ability to make a contribution that does go directly to helping us continue to put on the program and the show. All donations are greatly appreciated. Also, as I learned earlier, right before we started, it is a good idea to register each week for the upcoming shows. As a security measure, we often, the actual Zoom link gets changed. So please make sure that that you continue to support us and that you register. And with that, I'll try to think about all the things I forgot to say when I come back in at the end. I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
Hello, everyone. Excuse me. I'm so excited to have three phenomenal women on our program today. We're going to be discussing what life was like before the ADA, what the ADA is doing now, and where we need to go in the future. So without further ado, I'm going to start off with Kathy Raggio, who's going to talk about life prior to the ADA.
Thank you, Katie. And hi, everybody. I volunteered to talk about life before the Americans with Disabilities Act and before Section 504, its predecessor, because I'm not an expert in the Americans with Disabilities Act like Marcia and Marion are. So, you know, we know that people experienced all sorts of issues with accessibility prior to the ADA, things like you know, buses and trains were not accessible, and the doctor's offices were not accessible. They didn't have to provide sign language interpreters for deaf patients and so forth. But I'm going to talk about my specific experience that happened to me to illustrate just how discrimination worked back then. I've written an essay about it called Discrimination 101, an introductory course, and it happened right after I graduated from high school. The year was 1965, and the day after I graduated from high school, I received a letter in the mail from the college of my choice, though not my dreams, and it was my housing assignment letter. And on it indicated my housing assignment was on Iron Street, and I knew there were no streets dissecting the campus, so I assumed that this was off campus. So the letter said to call the Dean of Women if you had any questions. So my mother immediately placed a call to the Dean of Women, and she could not get anywhere in her discussion with the dean. The dean was not budging, and so she gave the phone to me and said, "Here, you try to reason with her. Here, you try to reason with her," she whispered. So I got on the phone, and I couldn't get anywhere either, and so I reverted back to an authority figure. This was in an era where you had personal interviews, fortunately, before you went to college. They weren't optional, they were mandatory. So I'd had an interview with the Dean of Admissions the December before, and I had no idea what their policy was for housing. And he asked me if I'd be able to negotiate the campus. Those of you who know me know that I use a wheelchair now, but I did not then. I used the forearm crutches and wore a brace on my right leg. So getting around was not impossible, but it was not easy either. So the dean has said to me, "Well, I'll make a note that you need to be on campus because we house 90% of our freshmen off campus." So I said, "Great." And so I relayed this to the Dean of Women, and she immediately hung up and said she'd check with the Dean of Admissions. She called me back later and said that she had checked with him and he had verified our discussion, and that she would move me on campus as soon as housing became available, if it became available. So predictably in August, after one interim assignment, which was only 3 blocks off campus, the previous one was 6 blocks off, and this campus was on a hill. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I went to Bloomsburg University, and it's on a hill. So any roads, any housing off campus, you had to negotiate the hills in any direction. So I was placed then in a dorm on campus after this one interim assignment. And when we arrived, it was up 4 flights of stairs, and there was no elevator. So we moved me in, my family and I moved me in, and I began to walk up and down the stairs multiple times every day, because as you know, when you're going to college, you don't leave the dorm once at the beginning of the day and come back at the end of the day. You come back several times a day. So it was up and down and up and down. And word began to spread around campus of what was going on. My fellow students who were on the 4th floor of that dormitory, of course, talked to people who they knew, and word got around. And so the dean was getting a bad reputation. So I endured this, and my RA was a big advocate for me being moved to one of the newer dorms that had working elevators on campus. And the dean and her entourage, she always traveled with an entourage, accosted me one evening, a couple weeks later, in the dining hall, saying that she had gotten a report that I had been using the condemned elevator in this condemned dormitory. And this elevator went up on the boys' side. So I think she was more concerned that I was, breaching into the boys' dorm more than any of her other concerns. And, you know, I had no idea that there was an elevator that worked in this dorm. And so, you know, I was like, I had to restrain myself greatly, let's say that, after having negotiated a million steps over the course of the previous 2 weeks. And I held back and didn't argue with her. I just told her that I did not know that there was a working elevator and that I certainly had not used it. So I was rewarded for my restraint in another week by being placed in one of the new dorms with a working elevator. Now, the irony in all this is that Bloomsburg had what they called probationary freshmen, or probies, who were not fully admitted students. They could come in the summer, and if they passed 2 courses, 6 credits in the summer, they were then invited back as full-time students in January. So come January, I learned that these probationary freshmen, or probies, were rewarded not just with full-time status as students, but they were also given rooms in the new dorms. So that was the irony of her adherence, her staunch adherence to policy and procedure. And what I learned from this whole experience was that so much of discrimination that has gone on, not just for people with disabilities, but when we're talking about intersectionality with people of different races, is that discrimination is born of traditionalism and people's adherence to traditions. And it's more than unfortunate, but that was the way things were. And I would urge you to take a look at Ben Matlin's op-ed piece in USA Today yesterday, where he relays some of his experience before the ADA. And we all have our stories. Those of us who were around for a long time. Section 504 would have taken care of my problem. Then certainly it was the provisions of Section 504 were reinforced by the ADA. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. Now, Marion and Marcia, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? No? Okay.
This is Marcia. I think maybe I can cover that in my time.
Fabulous. All right. Next up, Marion Vessels. Talk to us about the ADA.
Okay, for some of you that don't know me, it's nice to see a lot of familiar faces here. I'm a wheelchair user. And so the advent of Section 504, which happened before I was disabled, and the ADA since has really made a significant difference in my life. Right now, 30 years after the ADA, you know, I rarely think to call ahead to a restaurant to make sure it's accessible. I kind of presume that, you know, many restaurants and most restaurants, unless they're in an older part of the city, are going to be accessible. I expect accessible restrooms that will have grab bars and the proper positioning of hand controls, railings, doors to make it accessible for me to get in. I expect more and more to see curb ramps and accessible parking, especially for the van that I use, to be able to get in and out of the van on a regular basis. And I presume that most businesses and government entities are going to be accessible for me. And that's kind of my legacy or my interaction with the environment, especially the built environment, as it relates 30 years past the signing of the ADA. Yesterday was a significant day for me personally because I was reflecting on how exciting it was to be sitting on the White House lawn 30 years ago yesterday in equally hot and humid weather. But just the palpable sense that it really was the beginning of our civil rights across not only government entities that were covered under Section 504, but private entities, that there really was this sense that it's going to be a different setting for people with disabilities. And for the 2,000 plus people on that White House lawn, some of who are on this call today, it really was a very special day. And a lot of things have changed, and we'll certainly be able to talk more about what's left to be done, because it's really hard to talk about the successes, at least for me, of the ADA without thinking of all of the things that have not happened and still have yet to be fully realized under the ADA. But there have been some significant changes, and I think it's really important for us to celebrate those successes so that we have the enthusiasm and the commitment to continue to fight for what's left to be done under the ADA. I think the ADA has really become synonymous with access. You often hear people referring to the ADA in any kind of access. Even though it wasn't covered under the ADA, it may have been covered under another law, or it didn't happen to around the ADA at all. But the ADA is really kind of synonymous in my mind with access. And you hear it all too often. And oftentimes in a technical setting, we have to correct people and say that really wasn't the ADA. But the ADA really has been something that I think has been phenomenal in terms of helping people across the board think about the expectation of full inclusion of people with disabilities. And if the ADA did nothing else, it really helped embed the concept of civil rights for people with disabilities. Because that's what the ADA is. It's not an access law. It's not just a building code law that I hear a lot about. It's not just mandatory parking. You hear an awful lot about handicapped parking or accessible parking. But it's really broad spread, and it really is talking about the civil rights of people with disabilities. The expectation that we should be included in all aspects of life. It also, I think, brought about the expectation and the information to the public about what the definition of people with disabilities is. I think prior to the ADA, people expected that people with disabilities were people who were like me in a wheelchair, were people with sensory disabilities, that they could see people who were blind, knowing that people who were deaf would be considered people with disabilities. They knew about people with intellectual disabilities and considered them to be people with disabilities. But very often, the majority of people with disabilities were not thought to be people with disabilities. People with psychological and psychiatric disabilities, people with genetic disabilities, breathing, cardiac, all kinds of non-obvious disabilities that are definitely considered disabilities under 504 and under the ADA. And I think there's been a greater recognition in the public that there is a very broad perspective of people with disabilities. And most people with disabilities do not have obvious disabilities. And that's really important as we look at further implementation of the ADA. I think today we see a greater visibility of those people with disabilities. Those of us with disabilities, we see lots more people on the street with a variety of different kinds of disabilities in public places. We'll see on TV and in movies and commercials, print ads, you'll see more and more people with disabilities being included, and not often just as a center point, but as a background, which is really ideal because they're considered to be the fabric of society and not just the person to be heroized or pitied, but just included. The ADA is broken down into 5 major sections. The first section is employment. And this was the first time that private businesses of 15 or more were required to provide accommodations to their employees with disabilities. And those provisions, those reasonable accommodations, take on a great deal of forms, such as flex time, providing the provision of equipment, looking at the way instructions are given, the office furniture itself, and most importantly right now, the working from home. Many people with disabilities, as a reasonable accommodation, were given the right to work from home as an accommodation. And it's one that was really hard fought for many people. And I've been reading lots of things in the press lately about how businesses, excuse me, are learning more and more from what they did for their employees with disabilities and providing that to all of their workers during the mandatory work from home period. So the provision under the ADA really has led the way to businesses to really recognizing across the board that people can indeed very functionally work from and effectively work from home. Employment is a huge area under the ADA, and like all provisions of the ADA, is hard to enforce and is done by complaint only, which is obviously I think one of the strongest challenges with the ADA. Under state and local government, places, state and local government, their buildings are required to be accessible, as well as all of their programs. And today you'll see often sign language interpreters, Braille, large print, notification on all kinds of public government forms that say, if you need an accommodation, let us know, we'll provide it. We see sign language interpreters now at many government briefings on the coronavirus. In Maryland, the governor uses a deaf interpreter who also has a secondary interpreter. So that information becomes provided in a more native form for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Really, the interpreter's become a local celebrity because he's so enthusiastic, and that expectation that people with disabilities are included in information that it's critical as the coronavirus has been a legacy of the ADA. Voting sites are now required to be accessible with Braille forms and verbal instructions to allow those with vision disabilities so they can vote independently. There are mandates to make sure that voting sites are fully accessible to people with mobility disabilities. City buses all over the country now are essentially accessible with very few exceptions. Now, whether the lifts work right or people are able to use them effectively is another story. But there are buses that are now accessible for people. We also have a paratransit system that mandates a limited scope around the provision of public buses to provide door-to-door service for people with disabilities. Trains now have lifts, portable lifts, to allow people to use train systems. One of the major concepts under the Americans with Disabilities Act is integration. We look at the provision of services, not in an isolated form, which had also happened quite commonly, where there would be standard services for everybody else, and then there'd be the provision of accessible services in a separate and very often not equal area. Integration is something we look and count on under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And there was a Supreme Court decision called Olmstead that required a state, and now all states, to look at two women who were in an institution and gave them the right to be able to move out of that institution and into the community with community support, so that they were fully integrated into their community and not isolated. We still have forms of this today. For the first time, privately owned businesses are required to provide goods and services in physical locations to people with disabilities in an accessible manner. So all new construction is required to be accessible. The older buildings are required to be accessible as they can be. And some physically can't be due to their location and structure. But there is no such thing as grandfathering that we often hear about. Well, it was before the ADA, so it doesn't count. No, it did count. It does count. Those businesses must do all that they can to provide accommodations to people with disabilities. So we're looking at the provision of goods and services. We're looking at businesses providing interpreters, information in alternate formats. We're looking at their websites, which are places of commerce, and also are required to provide access to people with vision disabilities and with hearing disabilities. Examples of accommodations: live performances now have sign language interpreters. Plays schedule audio description performances. Sports arenas now have accessible seating that allows for folks who are in a seated position to be able to look out and still see the action on the field, even if people are standing up in front of them. We now have a broad definition of service animals, although it's been limited to service animals are dogs who've been specifically trained, and or in a few exceptions, miniature horses. But they're trained to provide a service to an individual with a disability, and they're allowed to go anywhere that the disabled individual is allowed to go. Educational entities provide more classes to, and structures within their campus to be fully accessible. So it further builds on Section 504 that Kathy talked about in her setting. Department stores are required to have accessible changing rooms. I remembered before the ADA, people were shocked when I was asked, where's the changing room for me? And it was like, you want to try the clothes on before you buy them? So I had to take everything home with me, try it on, and then bring it back because there wasn't a place that I could go. It just never dawned on them. And actually, I've actually seen now stores that have had wheelchair mannequins. So there was an acknowledgement that maybe somebody in a wheelchair would actually buy clothes. Telecommunications are now more accessible. 30 years ago, a deaf individual wouldn't be able to call and get a pizza or get a doctor's appointment easily. There were voluntary relay programs, but they were just that. They were voluntary. Now we have a national relay system, and we have captioning on TV and programs, movies. We don't really use the relay as much anymore because technology has overtaken it with things like texting. But it exists for the people who need it. Some movies have audio descriptions so that people can easily use them in captioning. The fifth area of the ADA covers the prohibition of retaliation when someone files an ADA complaint. The ADA is not a comprehensive law. It is hard to enforce, and it's really the bare minimum of accessibility. I've always described ADA as the basement. You can do no less than the ADA, but you're really encouraged to do far much more to assure the inclusion of people with disabilities. Look at universal design and universal design concepts to assure that all people with disabilities benefit from the concepts of the ADA, which really is civil rights in the inclusion of people with disabilities into the fabric of our lives. I think I'm going to stop now and ask my colleagues to chime in, because I know this wasn't comprehensive. Kathy or Marcia?
I think you did a marvelous job, Marianne, of giving a sense of you know, our achievements, what we've accomplished over the last 30 years, and you've painted a very bright and exciting picture.
You're muted, Kathy. Kathy, you're muted.
I said you've captured the excitement of the ADA and why we celebrate it every year. It really has revolutionized America.
Wonderful. All right, so Marcia, where are we heading? Can you give us some insight?
Sure. This is the world according to Marcia. This is not scientific research. This is not anything other than my reflections on where we're heading. And because this is a birthday party, I want to be celebratory. I want to be positive, but I also feel like I have to sound the warning that we could lose it. We could lose it all. And if people don't believe that, I think it doesn't take much to look around and see what has happened with COVID and how many new and intriguing barriers have sprung up as a result of the pandemic. So we're looking at new physical barriers that the Access Board didn't anticipate when they wrote the ADA standards, and DOJ didn't anticipate when they wrote the ADA regulations. When we're looking at a situation where there is a belief, and rightfully so, that some of these barriers are absolutely necessary to protect public health and safety. And as much as we want to say that, you know, when it comes to public health and safety versus the ADA wins, that's not true. The ADA doesn't win. But I personally feel it's very possible, and I've seen a lot of good resources come forward to have both public safety and maintain a barrier-free environment. For the numbskull who puts the outdoor seating in the accessible parking space, well, we're going to have to educate that person. And so the theme of my remarks here is be visible, be inclusive, and be forceful, and maintain our forward movement. We really have to maintain our forward movement. We can't do backsliding. And that is going to require, for some people who were born after the ADA became law and after all of these wonderful things that Kathy and Marianne have talked about have come to fruition, and it's part of your set of expectations. You expect the dressing room to be accessible. You expect to find an accessible restroom. You expect to find an accessible way of doing business with the entity because the ADA requires it. But we're going to have to work very hard to ensure that our expectations continue to be realized. One of the areas that I think that we are going to have to really put a lot of energy in is healthcare. And I don't want to talk about cures. I'm a person who has low vision, epilepsy, and a hearing disorder. And I'm not looking for a cure. I want to be acknowledged for who I am and what I am. The worst thing that an employer ever said to me was, "You do so well, you cope so well that I forget you have a disability." And I found that to be quite offensive. I don't think that it's polite to forget that someone has a disability, because if you're that person's boss, you have some obligations to that person because of their disability in terms of accommodating them. And so there's not an excuse based on whether the person copes well or doesn't cope well to fail to accommodate their needs. But in terms of healthcare, we have got to get on an equal footing. We've got to get to a place where people with disabilities and others have universal health care, where someone is not going to be forced into poverty because they have a disability or because they are vulnerable to becoming a person with a disability. And so from my perspective, universal health care is an absolute rock bottom necessity if we are going to remain on an equal footing with others. As a person with a vision impairment, I can say many of the things that I have to buy for my vision impairment are simply not covered by health insurance, period, end of story. I use a closed circuit television reading device, a big magnifier, and I use adaptive equipment software on my computer. I wear glasses. I have a telescope that I use for watching plays and things like that. None of that is covered by insurance. In fact, as a federal employee, I had put away some money to buy my new CCTV, and I had to get a doctor's signature. This is post-ADA, by the way, and a federal employee. I had to get a doctor's signature to be allowed to use my own money to buy my CCTV that I had put aside in my flexible spending account. My colleague who used a wheelchair did not have to do that. My colleague didn't have to do that because I think that the awareness of disability is perhaps a little bit better in terms of people with visible disabilities. If you're using a wheelchair, you can't escape being seen. You're going to be seen as somebody with a disability. I am one of those people that sort of treads the margins, and so my disability is not easily recognized, and oftentimes the ADA is not all that much help for me. In terms of education, we've seen what's happened to kids with disabilities during this pandemic. We've seen that children with disabilities who have various needs, that they are guaranteed to have those needs satisfied under previous law, 94-142 IDEA. Some of those children are not being educated in the way they need to be educated. And you would think that kids with disabilities would be a priority, but it's very much the same old, as we all remember the days when it would snow and they would say, schools are open today, but there's no transportation for the disabled. And I'm afraid that we're seeing some of that happen. Very recently, a friend reached out to me and said that a teacher in Maryland was planning to require her special ed. This is before they decided that we would be totally online, but that she was going to require her special ed students to wear diapers, even though they were not students who needed to wear diapers, because she wanted to keep them out of the toilets that were shared with other kids. Again, this is discrimination. This is discrimination that continues. And yes, if there was a complaint, I think that discrimination would be completely stopped cold. But there has to be a complaint, and there can't be a complaint until the potential complainant is aware of the planned discrimination. So again, there needs to be more and more education for the people that are doing the service, the training, the education, and teachers in terms of awareness of what our rights are, because they have to be partners in protecting our rights. In terms of transportation, autonomous vehicles are on the horizon. We fought long and hard to get accessible public transportation. I remember the days when Section 504 even required accessible public transportation, required lifts on buses, but there were transportation providers that would say, well, we have a lift, we just don't use them. Well, with autonomous vehicles, I think the way we travel around cities is going to change tremendously. And even if we do continue to have public transportation with buses and the like, where you would shuttle a group of people here or there, we may not have drivers. So we're going to need to have engineers and others alert to the design challenges that are going to occur in terms of autonomous vehicles, just for people who use wheelchairs, but it's also for people with vision impairments and other disabilities. So if you're a young person out there and you're thinking about your future, think about engineering, think about architecture. Think about some of those careers where you can have not only an impact on society as a whole, but also you can have an impact on the accessibility of our environment. Speaking of accessibility, housing, we have the Fair Housing Act, we have the ADA, and all of those are good. They're good starts, but the Fair Housing Act is very weak, particularly in its design standards. Under the Fair Housing Act, you can have a bathroom in your apartment that you cannot turn around in and where you cannot close the door. That's allowed. That's not accessible. That's not even the very beginnings of accessibility in terms of dignity and privacy. So we have to improve the design standards for the Fair Housing Act. We have to deal with the threats to the Fair Housing Act and its enforcement in terms of disparate impacts, because people with disabilities do experience disparate impacts, and that's basically a legal term that deals with sort of an analysis of the outcome of housing providers' behavior over time, and enables an attorney to show that over time, people with disabilities have not achieved the same goals as others, or any other minority group for that matter. In terms of jobs, Marion talked about equal employment and all of that, and talked about the fact that, of course, this only gets enforced by way of complaint. That's true with all of the ADA. And we have to learn how to complain. We have to learn how to take the risk of enforcing and asking others to enforce our rights. We have to step up, and we have to be able to say this isn't right. And we can take a page out of Black Lives Matter for that, because our lives matter too, and our jobs and our welfare, all of that matters. And I think we're going to have to train one another on how to address discrimination when it occurs, because I think oftentimes we are far too passive. We count on someone else to notice the problem and address it, and we need to step up, and we need to address our own needs by way of complaint, because that's the way most civil rights work. What's it going to take? Again, be visible. Don't let people say, oh, I didn't notice your disability, or you know, you do so well, your disability doesn't really count. If you have a disability, it's part of who you are, and it's part of what is special about you and why you have various rights. And so I urge people to don't hide the disability. Step up and own it, and advocate for yourself and for other people with similar disabilities. Be present. Join in. We're not all straight. We're not all gay. We're not all Hispanic or black or white. We need to join in with other minority groups and represent people with disabilities in coalition. We need to also own the other things that we are, because we're not just people with disabilities. We're mothers, we're fathers, we're all of these things. And so bring that disability awareness and the disability presence to your other groups. Be inclusive. Recognize that disability isn't just one thing or one type of disability. I think that we have got to start paying some attention to people with multiple chemical sensitivities or chemical sensitivities and other disabling conditions that, again, are rather invisible. But if we are not inclusive of these people, I think that we're going to find that the world is going to be a much tougher place to live in. Our environment is suffering, and I think that people with chemical sensitivities, environmental illness, are the canaries in the coal mine. And I think we have to embrace their message, even if their message is different from ours. And lastly, be forceful. Learn about your civil rights. And it may take, and I think everybody has seen over the last 2 days, the images of the Capitol crawl. People with disabilities crawling up the steps of the Capitol to dramatize that we demand our citizenship, we demand to be included, and if we have to crawl, we will. And I think those days aren't over. They're not solely in the past. We may find different avenues and different ways of expressing our solidarity and expressing our needs, but we have to continue to do that. We cannot become complacent. I think I'll stop there and ask Kathy and Marian, did you want to add anything?
I did. I would like to just to comment on 2 issues that I think we need to be concentrating on in the future related to the ADA. And that's, first of all, the integration mandate that Marian referenced before, that in the case of Elsie versus Olmstead was upheld by the United States Supreme Court. I don't think that we can fully realize the integration mandate of the ADA without addressing more affordable and accessible housing. I mean, we see right now through this pandemic that an enormous number of the people who are losing their lives are stuck in nursing facilities. In Maryland, it's last I saw was 63% of the deaths in Maryland had been people in institutions. And we know that those institutions in Maryland are predominantly nursing facilities because we don't have too many people left in the state-run institutions. So, you know, we've got to continue to do a full court press on affordable and accessible housing, where people are not going to be able to be diverted from institutions or brought out if they do end up there. Employment is the
excellent point, Kathy. I'm glad you mentioned that.
The employment section of the ADA is the least successful. And, you know, as you rightfully point out, Marcia, you know, people need to be taught how to complain, except when you're experiencing job discrimination and you have no job, it is the worst time to complain about anything. Depends too on the field that you're in. I know I experienced disability discrimination in employment on a couple of occasions, but I was well known in the disability community. I wasn't about to blow the whistle and complain because I would have gotten a reputation. And I didn't need that in addition to the job discrimination that I was experiencing. So I just zipped it and didn't say a thing. And I think that that's how so many people feel. I mean, if your livelihood depends on securing a job and you find yourself without one, you're not likely to complain. So I think that's one of the reasons why that section of the ADA hasn't been the most successful.
I think, Kathy, you're absolutely right.
I want to say one more thing. I think that, you know, if I could make one change, and over the years when I was at Independence Now, I used to ask people, have you ever experienced job discrimination, or have you experienced it in your job search if I was interviewing them? And to a one, people would describe to me what they were experiencing. And I think that one of the best services that could be done would be to provide training over and over again for people doing the interviewing on how to do a good interview with all people, not just people who they suspect to have a disability. And if they learn to do that and draw out the best in all people, they're going to find some hidden talents that they didn't expect among all the people that they're interviewing. And I think that that would greatly benefit people with disabilities in their job searches. And I'll be quiet. Go ahead, Marcia. I'm sorry.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I just want to add that for those of us who have had jobs or do have jobs, I think we have some duty to pay it forward and help folks who are in that situation, and help folks learn how to deal with these situations of discrimination, because they do still exist. And even in an ideal world where, you know, everybody has health care, et cetera, there are always going to be people with disabilities, or people who are perceived as people with disabilities. And so I think we have to make it clear that as a community, we are here for one another. We've seen this happen in other minority groups, and nobody can do this on their own. It's very difficult. And folks need to have that kind of support. Which, of course, Kathy, you've been doing all your life.
I think just to wrap
Marion?
Up, our message really is that we've got an awfully long way to go to making the ADA really live up to its promise. We need to be the change agents. Each of us need to commit to it. We need to know what the laws are, what it does include and what it doesn't, be effective in our knowledge and our commitment to making changes. And because it is complaint driven, we need to continue that education process. So I think, you know, if each of us really just committed to doing one thing in this year of the 30th anniversary, it would be a tremendous sea change, whether it be employment, physical access, whatever. So I think we have a long way to go before we see what we want to happen, but it's not going to happen without us.
Right.
I'm feeling inspired, also a little bit concerned, but overall inspired. Thank you, Marion, Kathy, and Marcia, for taking the time and delving out all the wisdom and experiences that you've had over the years. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dave. We're running out of time.
Hang on, I have a question.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, I have a quick question for the panel, because you guys really did focus in on the weakest part of the ADA in some ways, which is the employment title. I guess my question is, how would you modify it? In other words, if you could wave your magic congressional wand tomorrow, what language would you put into Title I that would make employment more likely for people with disabilities? I would note that after the ADA passed in the 90s, there was an actual decrease in employment for folks with disabilities. Employers,
Right.
when you polled them, they said, oh, well, you know, we're just afraid to hire anybody because we might have to fire them, so we just don't hire them. So if you could wave your magic congressional law wand, what would you do?
I would do just what I said, and that would be to make training for anybody doing interviewing and hiring mandatory. And
I would go further than that, Kathy. I would make it mandatory to have a reasonable accommodation policy.
Yep,
Just
that
like
too.
Title II
Okay,
entities.
that's two things.
Title II entities have to have a self-evaluation and a transition plan. I would love to see employers have to have a written policy of non-discrimination and reasonable accommodations.
I think that would be great. The other thing I don't think I'd make part of the act that I think would be very helpful would be if all centers for independent living would get involved with employment groups, local groups such as Kiwanis, Rotary, etc. Instead of talking to ourselves all the time, let's talk to employers and tell them what we're observing and hearing and experiencing ourselves. Or that is being relayed to us through staff that we hire.
I agree with all that. I would second.
Thank you all very much. That's excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, Marcia, were you going to say one last thing?
Nope.
Okay.
I'm good.
I want to, we are out of time, but I want to thank again all of the panelists. It was great to hear you all, and I very much heard a call to action there, which will not go, was not unnoticed. So I appreciate that as well. I want to just let people know next week we have Stan Holbrook will be here. I know Stan vaguely from Pennsylvania. He'll be talking on intersectionality. I think that's going to be an excellent session next week, so I hope you guys can make it for that. And on 2 or 3 Mondays from now, I can't do the math, but it's the 17th of August. We will be using this platform as in a sort of a more special way to review and get input on our new state plan for independent living, the new 3-year plan that's been developed. We want to get information and hear from you. So please make sure that you tune in then. Again, thank you to all. Don't forget to register for next week. If you can help out with a generous donation, that would be most appreciated. And thank you all. And happy anniversary, ADA.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Yes, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Next week.
Have a great week.
If anybody,
This is Jessica. I'm so sorry. I'm so busy now. Can you remind me of what is next week that you said to register for? Because I'm in so much stuff. I don't know when I'm coming forward.
Next week, registering for this live stream, the IAM meeting for the IAM live stream for next week, Stan Holbrook will be the special guest, and he will be talking on intersectionality. So he will be discussing all of the intersection of disability and race and multiply marginalized individuals, and the things that we all hopefully can do to create a more equitable world for all of us. So I think it'll be a really great discussion. So just go back to re-registering for IM every week, re-register. If you've registered, you will get an email that has a registration link in it. So we try to make it as easy as possible for you.
And thank you guys. The reason.
All right, everyone have a great rest of your week.
All right, thank you.